Okay, I guess this is everyone. Thank you guys for joining me today. I know everything has been so a whirlwind going virtual with Netroots this year. Got my Netroots shirt on. My name is Chanelle Helm. I use the pronouns she, her, they, them. Anything that's respectful, nothing that invokes hierarchy or monarchy. I don't like those things. Um, and I want to discuss, I want to provide this space as well. I use the word discussion because I love having conversations with people, and I think the practicing of outreach is more of a training than we know. And so most of this work comes by way of that. Um, I am the core lead organizer of Black Lives Matter Louisville and a co-founder of Black Lives Matter Louisville. And in that work has always been um, a work around the placement of Black people in the city of Louisville. Just like other places, Louisville has gone through a tremendous spatial deconcentration tactic. And of course, that's gentrification. But for decades, we've had city leaders, elected officials, um, maneuver manifestos that essentially not only just displaced Black populations, but also decimated them. So utilized a lot of racial banishment in that displacement. The latest displacement that we had was the removal of folks from Beecher Terrace, which was one of the projects that were erected um, in the result of the revitalization after the New Deal. So those funds that came in to make sure that working class folks had somewhere to live during the Great Depression was the erection of this particular location. In that particular location also sits one of the historic and only parks that was designated for Black people at that time. So making this part of the city, which was right close to an economic center for Black Louisvillians, um, now that we call Ninth Street, and I'll get into that for a little bit. The place where Black folks were destined to go. So a location that Black folks had to live, but also turned into, as we've seen recently, where folks end up, right? And I use that because as I move through the training, I want folks to invoke what it means to have and call home. So we'll do that in just a second. What we learned and what we've been learning, not only in the US, but across the world, wherever Black or Brown folks are, we are seeing people be racially banished, and that is the removal of people via death or in prison. And this particular location saw the removal of folks through prison by being one of the most notorious places in the state, but also the country. 1 in 3 folks from this housing project were placed into prison. The militarized police, so SWAT and other street teams, were a constant in this neighborhood. And there's also a documentary and a few other pieces that are being developed right now to make sure that the return happens and takes place. However, what we do see in these new projects, some of those funded by federal Sorry, y'all.
Welcome back, Chanelle. Welcome back.
Did you let them know about the weather here?
I did. I said we had technical difficulty. The technical difficulty is it's storming.
It's been happening for a few days, y'all, so it's fun. And I think we're all used to it now by Zoom. That is one of the main, where I left off talking about the displacement of racial banishment around this particular project is where I really am focusing a lot of that work on. And with that is, how do we create community with those who are being displaced? So who do not have a physical community, but who need to have a belonging in that, so that they can not only just survive, but that they're being thriving. What we did notice with the displacements and the racial banishment is that the return from prison or the return from jail was complicated because there was no location to live. So if folks, with the onset of coronavirus, because we're in a different moment now due to that, and all of our social justice has now been confined with this global pandemic, the failed attempt of surviving a global pandemic. We are now looking at what it looks like with these folks who are actually in the margins and drowning by them. And what does housing look like for them to return, but then also to return to their space? And one of the questions that I ask for folks to begin to answer that question is, what does home mean? The definition for home, this white supremacist definition for home, means the place where one lives permanently, especially as a member of a family or a household. So I want to ask that question to our participants and just give that definition of what home means. Take like about 5 minutes to think about that. Not something that we typically think about. We holler about we want to go home. I'm ready to go home. I'm going home from work. But what does home mean to you? In just a few minutes, I'll give my definition.
And if you would, you can type those into the chat, your thoughts on home.
Yeah, I do want to read some of these out. I placed mine in there as well. For me, home is safety, security, and being comfortable. And I love that Ryan, I'm pronouncing your name correctly, says where I can be my unpolished self. That's very much important for folks. Kim says safety, security, and community. I think we all are mentioning safety and having a way to be safe. A place you can be in comfort with some sense of privacy for hours on end. Yes, Dustin, especially during now. Kim also says peace. We'll talk about that as well. Francis says, home is where my people and family are either blood or chosen. Queer and trans POC community come through. Yes, we want to discuss that as well as a major priority piece around what this work looks like. Gail says, a dwelling, a place of peace and refuge. I just see this and some Lisby says, I think of home as a place where there's a cyclical relationship of investment and nourishment. I like that because then we can determine what that investment actually looks like. And then D says, where I only have to be me. Hey, and where I have to be me. Oh, it came through twice. Okay. Rashad says, could people sit there to oh, okay, yes. Oh, because people aren't seeing all of them. Thank you, Rashad, so much. Could people set there too when you're typing into the chat to all panelists and attendees? That way everyone sees the responses. I think we have Zoom fatigue. Has anybody defined that yet? I know there's probably think pieces on it. We're like all in Zoom fatigue. Creighton says, it's changed over the years, but home is where I'm away from harm, and that changes its life changes becomes life challenges because she's fat, disabled, queer, Black woman. Come on, Zoom sanity, because we just don't have it all. Yes, and I'm glad Creighton brought that up. Those are some other pieces to what is priority, and then making sure that we can question in these answers our ableism, and I think I do want to start there. For most folks, home doesn't exist. And I don't want that to be a very sad part, but for the majority of Americans, and right now due to coronavirus, home is not a place. Home is a figurative location of what safety could possibly be. And in that 50% is a large amount of folks who dare to say, and some who are scared to say, that home is not safe. Home is not where they can be their bravest. Home is not somewhere where they can have a meal, a necessity. Home may not even be somewhere where they have plumbing, a place to keep them clean, and a priority in this time right now. Also, some homes are not equipped to handle folks who are differently able, especially those who can walk, those that can utilize their arms, and others who, for the most part, for those folks, home does rest in their minds. And I think I do love that a lot of us utilize that they want to seek safety when they think about home. The other priority population, and this is what we'll get into as we start to like dive into what that looks like and how the work can be maneuvered. So I want you all to be thinking too about like how you provide safety and security for folks who don't have home. If that's some of the work that you do, we want to be able to share those pieces of how we make sure people are safe. And I believe it was Francis that brought up how they build home. And we know that for the queer and trans population, home is something, particularly Black and other POC folks, it's something they have to build. It's something that is a bit of a triggering term for the most part, where a lot of us may have had home all of our childhood. I know for myself, there wasn't a home per se that I went to for the rest of my childhood. I didn't become a part of a permanent home until I was 12. And I had to do that because my mother had health issues and I had to live with my mother with a family member. And so that was the longest that I've had home all my life. And then when we were able to buy a home later on and then have a place where we do call home. But for the most part, gentrification is destroying a lot of folks' homes. And I don't think that some of our people who actually live in our communities have a clear understanding of what home means as well. So we want to be able to change the narrative for what home is. We can say that home is a figurative place, a place that we look for, and in our definition, is a place that we look for safety, that we try to find comfort, not only for our physical bodies, but for the bodies that we live with inside, and security. And maybe that security is something that we have to build inside of the home. We also know that that security is one where we're able to move in the way that we have mobility, and in the lack of thereof mobility. With coronavirus onset, we know that home is something that is being used as a weapon. And so as we vision out, when we think about the world we fight in, what are some of the ways that we believe liberation can be found? And I want to use that as we start to talk about like what we can do and what you can do as far as mutual aid. Take a minute to answer that, and I will put it in the chat. I'll put it in. As an organizer, I'm really excited that this change has taken place so tumultuously this year, right? A lot of us have also forgotten at the beginning of this year, we thought we were going to be bombed off the earth thanks to Trump's ass. But that also set up a different way that we maneuver through the world. A lot of that turned dark for people. And then coronavirus hit, and I know it is still scary for folks, especially if you live in the more populous areas. But for a lot of folks throughout the US who don't live in those areas, a lot of manipulation took place to assume that one particular group of people were the only people who were deemed essential. And with that, those terms of who is worthy or not, we're having a stronger fight against what it looks like to make sure that everybody can have the needs that they need. And that need that they need is to hunker down, right? And be able to quarantine somewhere safe. And so for the vast majority of Americans, but particularly people who live in middle America and some of the other size cities, They don't have anywhere to hunker down, and the manipulation over housing has come up. So for example, here in Louisville, we have seen eviction court go to a space of happening every day. And in that space is landlords, not just individual landlords, but also property management companies, holding people responsible for 4 months of rent that they cannot take because their jobs are completely gone or they do not have a location. So home for them, for the majority of folks in America, has been really harsh due to extensional hurt and harm that's happening outside. We're also seeing those landlords and property management companies play with folks' necessities, including water and other things. D says, in fighting together. And so once coronavirus took place, I was going to make up a word, right? It's an old word. Mutual aid pockets began to jump up around the country. And it made me feel some type of way because of the work that I do, which I'll go into. But I want to make sure that we all know that the work that we do in fighting for social justice or progressive alliances lie with those who are targeted the most. And if those people who are directly impacted, a word that is becoming commodified, are not leading that work, then we are not moving progressive work. And we have to understand that. If the space is not made for the trauma and also the pain that is a result of extenuating legislation that has been harmful to people, or the lack thereof of responses that our government systems are made of, then we are not moving the work correctly, and we are leaving people behind in doing the work that they have built up. And so that is what is taking place with a lot of the mutual aid networks that were created due to coronavirus. I know locally some were made to support their friends, and that made me feel some type of way, because when we do work with each other and we do work within our communities and our networks, we do make sure that the people that are on our teams and on our squads are taken care of, because we know we can't move that work. And if that is new to you and that's something that you do not do, then part of your progressive life must be to make sure that your team members and the people that you call crew, or the people that you do this work with, are taken care of. That you make sure you move at the speed of trust at the things that they need so that you can get the work done. For example, here we have a daily call at 9 o'clock. It was just seemed to be the time that everybody was actually still. And I had to move the agenda around so that we weren't just doing updates. And it was kind of triggering for people, especially if your update had to be something really hard. And maybe it was an action. Maybe you were in jail the night before. But in that update, we had to begin with a wellness check-in, like how are you doing and how are you feeling? So it isn't a place where you can just be like, I'm all right, I'm okay, because that okay and all right might be bottled and it could come up at any time in our work. We are an uprising city, so at any moment, rapid response is necessary. If we're not attentive to that, then who gets harmed? And that is the work that we do with our communities who are directly impacted. That has been able to change a lot of the relationships that we are building within our team and within that structure. And I am one that is optimistic and hoping that work can move forward. A lot of that work does linger around housing. And what does it mean when someone is telling you that they have COVID, or that you've been exposed to COVID, or that when we're protesting, we have to take time away from being out in the streets and then move ourselves into a place of quarantine? And then what about knowing that the people who are leading protests for the first time in their lives, or who are meeting the police officers who have done them dirty in some type of way, have to hunker down and do that, and they do not have a place to do that for, because they do not have home, or they've been displaced and they live with several folks in that one place. That is the visual that you need to have as you move through this work, and we're looking at that right now. 48% of people in Kentucky are up for eviction. Before this took place, 23% were already in a pathway that we see that 48% now. That does mean that over 60% of people are housing insecure. Folks may not want to say it because we have utilized the use of housing as a commodity that people need to judge their living standard on. So day in and day out, and I am so surprised that Creighton is here, and I love that because I do work with Creighton, where they are in, I was going to say Jersey. I am so sorry, in Philly. If any other, I did not get that mixed up. Don't y'all come for me. But we've been able to utilize mutual aid. So the nature in which we communicate, also the nature in which we prioritize the folks who need that support first. And that's what mutual aid is, where we have decided to make sure that the white supremacist notion of socialism is the one who's going to be able to define mutual aid for BIPOC people who have been utilizing mutual aid as a means to survive, but also thrive in their natural world and in the worlds that have been taken over by colonialism. Colonialism and white supremacy, progressiveness do not make way for mutual aid to exist because they do not prioritize those people who are demonstrated the most need during this time. So I still want to use the coronavirus meets the global uprising within the movement for Black Lives as a way for us to prioritize who actually needs housing and who actually needs that support. So Dia also says protests are still happening in Louisville every night. Folks need checked on and supported in their work. Lots of housing and food insecurity all over the Commonwealth. Come on, Dee, thank you so much. Dee, do you live here? Let's check. Is this your real name? And Dee is speaking to that, and that's the reason why I want to amplify that. So one of the methods that we use to address how mutual aid has been taken and moved away from us is introduce a reciprocity direct giving system. Mostly individual reparations is what that's called. And so that reparations not only takes place in the movement of funds, majority, of course, because we still live in a capitalist system, that reciprocity also takes place in the movement of labor. And the theory behind that is, and has been true thus far, is that white folks, particularly able-bodied white folks, are able to move through spaces a lot smoother than people of BIPOC ancestry, as well as their physical attribute. I say that because we do have a lot of folks who pass as white and who also are white adjacent who do work for us. Asians who know that some people may not know what they look like. And it's just speaking to the bias of the nature in which white people exist, right? They are able to particularly push white folks to make sure that they are standing up and also physically moving that work for those folks that they need to move the work for. So I will talk about Creighton's work a little bit because I love how her work is only centered on queer trans folks, but also families who we know don't have access to those areas. For example, we have moms who are needing to move through the CPS world, but also may have a child that is transgendered or or queer. That complicates that movement. And people who sit in those seats, those clerks or whoever they are, tend to move their bias into the work, right? Your work is to fill out some paperwork and move that along. Instead, you are judging the family based on what you have and decided to attribute that to them. That then complicates that moving of the work. Now, if that mom or even that trans person addresses that person, it becomes very complicated. Where white folks can come in at is to be able to address that and move it along, actually getting the supervisor's name. I mean, you got to carry in some spaces. And once they start carrying, Karening, let's make that a word. We're gonna make that a definition. They can get the name of that supervisor, emails, all type of shit that I've never been able to get, that Creighton won't be able to get when we step in and support people, and that family or that Meg may not be able to get, marginalized gendered person. And so we've been able to establish pockets of those folks across the nation, particularly by states. I made sure that the women that, because it's mostly only been white women, their husbands just go to work and make the money, are available, but move that work on the ground. So what does it look like when you build an anti-racist space and then be able to provide that for folks in crisis who are Black and Indigenous, or who are trans? And then I work with our trans babies, because I'm old. Yeah, I'm 40. I don't mind. I still don't have no gray hair though. The work we do for our trans babies and our trans community is very precious to us because we know what can happen on the other side of insecurity. And we want to make room for our work for them, particularly because home is not even an option. Home is, it almost feels slang when they say it, because I know what that means. And I know that their life is dependent on being able to be somewhere and rest their heads. And so, getting a bit emotional, sorry, because some of our babies have been thrown away in other places where they shouldn't have been by progressive organizations, and definitely the nonprofit complex, industrial complex. Let's just be clear, because we have had situations where nonprofit agencies have called the police on them, have also thrown them out on the streets, which can be very vulnerable, especially if that trans person takes place in sex work. And coronavirus, we saw a very complex mental health situation that was taking place with our trans sex working young folks. And so it's been extremely hard making sure that people understand that whatever they ask for should be given to them and not questioned, but also that we have to make space for the fact that they could at any moment not be available to us. And that we must support every need that they have, especially communications. So I have a trans baby here who never communicates with me at all. And I get it, you know what I'm saying? There's been a lot of trust issues and stuff. But when she asks, I make sure that I answer, and then I make sure that that is there. And I make sure that other folks know that that can take place for them. Particularly with the protests, we have seen our queer and gender nonconforming and trans folks arrested, and the trauma that happens when you have to enter jail, and then they want to utilize dead names. They also want to utilize genders that you are not attributing to yourself, and pushing you into places of your assignment, which is not at all which is really sick though, but it's a part of this industrial complex, right? To make sure that we're breaking down people's notion of safety and security. And so we were able to set up a mutual aid system where I have assistants who actually make sure they're communicating with our trans and gender nonconforming folks and making it comfortable for them to receive help that we know that we can guarantee them, and make sure that they receive, and just taking advantage of stuff too. So I want to see if there's any questions or if anybody has anything that they want to say along that lines of just the perimeter of what this work can look like. I'll go ahead and go into the next piece, but I am going to make space for that. I'm just going to detail the next piece around how we can maintain and interrupt the disruption around gentrification, right? And I'll utilize Louisville because it's cute. And for some of the resources that we use, I will share them with you. And please share these wildly. Yes, let's just be wild about it. No, but for real, let's be wild about it. Like, it's cancel the rent right now. You know what I'm saying? And we're still don't have a full force movement on cancel the rent. It's like, ugh. Well, it might have been in the pieces I was getting ready to go into, Lord. Is there a way for financially privileged to provide financial resources to mutual aid? Absolutely. Hey, that is where I was getting ready to go. Okay, so the perimeter of making sure that we can utilize, I like that, privilege money or reparations for mutual aid is establishing folks who have the skills to move that. I want to make this PowerPoint. I lost my other PowerPoint. And that's exactly what I was talking about. It's like the skills and things. So for the most part, when we began moving the white folks into our spaces around the issues that we had to find out who we were dealing with. Do we have people who are CPAs? We're talking about funds. Do we have people who are lawyers? Do we have people who can basically navigate those spaces by having that employment, right? Does your career enter into a space that you can provide the resources for that person? And that resource may also be skill. So utilizing what you actually utilize as your career, but in a place where you can support the crisis or the mutual aid network that's been set up by BIPOC people, particularly Black folks and Indigenous folks. And so we've done that in several ways. Creighton has a whole website. I'm gonna provide Creighton's website so people can see it because that's so cute. Am I spelling it right? I'll check to see. Because I always want to put the E on the end of it. I think I did do it wrong. I think I messed it all the way up. I did. It's an E. Look at this. It's real cute. And it's not necessarily like a Robin Hood thing, but what did Robin Hood do? If we're talking about the nature of that story, we're talking about somebody who was willing to rob the rich, somebody hoarding resources through the means of capitalism. So the unpaid labor and inexcusable neglect of folks' skills for compensation. So people are giving their lives for cash and money just to survive and to be able to have a home. So he took those resources away from them and gave them to folks who actually needed them. And in my sense of that word, and the way that we use this work is that folks are utilizing the difference in pay and stuff in a way that makes sure that the foundation rests on those folks who, as essential workers, work our grocery stores, our corner stores, our Dollar General stores, our gas stations, our fast food restaurants, these places that we find convenience in spending our small cash so that they can get paid. And most of those people still get paid $7.50 an hour. Dustin said, can I give people money over $600 without them or me having to report it to IRS? Workarounds in there. I'm an anarchist and I'm also like, fuck the IRS. But then also, what work are we doing to make sure that they're not there? I am totally an organizer and realize that shit does or does not exist. I'm going through that right now because of so much money that we've raised and whatever. But yes, where we have utilized taking advantage of the nonprofit industrial complex is making sure that we have fiscal sponsors who understand that our autonomous relationship is one that needs to be valued. And I think more often folks need to respect the autonomy of folks doing work when they ask for physical sponsorship, supporting them in learning the skills that they then had to pay for through the nonprofit. But that's also a mutual aid aspect, right? And not so much looking at this as business. So that's the part where we move the red tape away in nonprofits. So as a nonprofit, and if we build a nonprofit, Varnor's nonprofit status and their fiscal sponsorship, like just as ours, is to make sure that we're able to take in the funds that people, and these are under C3, of course, right? Take in the funds so that they then can get that tax credit because we still are in the IRS system. The IRS wants to see everybody's money and what everybody is doing. Ours is called Action for the People. So they immediately know that we have 4 main teams: housing, healing, education, and police abolition. Underneath police abolition is our community bail fund, the Louisville Community Bail Fund. And then the housing team is one particular, which is what I'm talking about today. We want to be able to move those funds the way that they need to be moved. So we also have our LLC where you can donate funds or give money to, and knowing that the services that you're paying for is the work that is happening. And I think that's where that can be misconstrued a little bit, because a lot of people were like, oh, you can't just do that. But speaking to a fiscal sponsor, not a fiscal sponsor, financial advisor is like, yes, you can do that as long as that's the work that you're saying that you're doing, right? Embezzlement and other agencies in which they don't move the work that they're requesting funds for is when things become illegal and when it gets dicey in the IRS. So essentially, you're giving funds through mutual aid in these projects in a way that you can give away the money. And what we're watching in this time is people vision out those things, right? Coronavirus put a very big, large handle on nonprofits. And so they weren't able to move their funds as they needed to. There had to be clearance at this level in this meeting. And how do we word this so that we can move outside of our mission to be able to move those fundings to directly where they have to go? So direct giving, instead of having this large barrier in the way for you to meet criteria and maybe only one certain people get that type of support. That's taking place in the government funds. So that is why it was important for nonprofits to be able to eliminate some of those barriers so that they can get those fundings or they can get the support they needed to those families and to people so that it happens immediately and not 2-3 weeks later. We watched this happen with the city trying to collect funds with their fiscal sponsor, right? We're just now being able to get that money in July for funds we needed back in March to help feed people and to help house people and make sure that they're housed. So the only housing that I'm willing to do is to make sure people get into new housing because they've already been displaced, or the find housing for folks who are already having to hunker down with a bunch of family members that they do not like. So in our work, we've been able to amass almost $250,000 to house people, take over housing that's been dilapidated, fix that housing up, and then put people in it. Does it take a lot? No, it doesn't take a lot. It takes commitment. And it takes to know that if we're moving in progressive ways, that we're going to have to push a lot of these progressive lawmakers to actually think in a more radical but revolutionary ways, right? I always like to mention that the Black Panthers were only around for like 3 years at their strongest. And they proceeded to produce work in many different ways, right? A lot of them have been hemmed up and in jail, but a lot of them are still here and being able to project what it is that they were envisioning during that 3 years. 3 years of vision, 3 years of a manifesto that told us to take care of our people so that we can do work. And if we move through that manifesto, then we're moving in a way that is actually eliminating a lot of the systemic ways that things show up. So who are some of these targets that we need to assess as we move through what gentrification looks like? We also need to assess who are the targets that we can work with in mutual aid, but also who are barriers to that mutual aid, right? So how does that funding look and how does that funding want to move? I'm also one of those people that's just like, move the fucking funds, but also move the fucking work, because it has to be moved right now. If we think about the pillar of power underneath housing, who sits in that foundation and who is holding it? A lot of our housing authorities are moving that work. We are fortunate here to have fallen into the house of the person that created the housing authority for our state, a white passing Black woman who was very critical and I'm going to add her to my list of resources, very critical of Black folks integrating without having the power to know that the integration was actually destroying their neighborhoods. And we see that today. Her name was May Street Kid. And if you know Black women from the South, they are lively. Passing for Black was that book. That's right. I want to get that right. I want to make sure I make a little link to it too. I'm making a PowerPoint for this because I've had to get a new laptop and several phones since the movement started. We just already know why. We fine. I'm okay. I'm used to it. Whatever. But I hate that I have to buy shit. That's the email that you can email me for the PowerPoint, because I want to make sure that what we're discussing and what we put in here is there. But she returned from the war and she was just like, oh, y'all shopping with the white folks now. Y'all done moved them in. What was disheartening about that is at that time, and this is that part where I was talking about Beecher Terrace, they had bulldozed our economic center here in Louisville, and we have not been able to have us had a safe economic center here in Louisville for Black folks. And because they did that, we lost a lot of power, just power in general. And so she was just like, I'm gonna run for office because y'all done made this up, basically. I mean, when you read the book, you can hear it in her voice, you know, as elders tell it. So she decided to run for office. She won. She sat in office with Georgia Powers, one of the first Black folks in our state, Black women to be a senator. And she stood in that house and she created the Kentucky Housing Authority. And we're thankful for that because I feel that energy as we move this housing work, which was just go get these houses and put people in them. At the end of the day, what does that do? You not only provide home and safety security for people, right? You give people a chance for them to use their own voice. So we're not using our voices for other people's voices. That irritates me. We are allowing them the opportunities to vision out what it looks like to have power. And in that is political power. When you own property, you gain more political power. Most of our power is sitting in the hands of white people who live in Florida, Indiana, out in the counties in Kentucky, or somewhere else, or in these property management companies. Any questions or anybody want to discuss or talk about that? Let me use this link because this is cute. Okay. And what immediately comes up when we talk to the families that we do this for is the systemic ways. They mention it themselves, so they don't need us to mention it for them, of how they have been neglected and how they have been pushed aside and how that took place. And they're able to name those things. They're able to name that maybe the housing authority lost their voucher after stating that they had the voucher, and then being that you can only come here in a certain amount of time and moving this work here, or I mean, moving your hours around. So you losing out on income to go somewhere where they don't even have the voucher. So manipulating people's stories and stuff. Oh my God. If states don't get their funding, property taxes will rise and make home ownership more unaffordable. That part. And so I think those are some ways, and if people want to knock those into the comments so we can do that when we leave here, some call to actions, let's move that council to rent, please. We have got to be pushing that hard, and we have got to push the housing authority and these other agencies that sit adjacent to our cities to move that as well. And that is something that, one, the impacted community has not seen, but we are definitely getting that into there. So what we've done with some of the moms and some of the folks that have been adjudicated by these systems have moved them into the place of power and utilize some of the thoughts and things that they have into action and helping them learn that. So creating incubators underneath our Root Causes Research Center, some homies decided that it was enough instead of having philanthropists fund those things, and created it themselves. And it helps community members research or pull action for the things that they see. And so right now that's around gentrification, because we're looking at that projects still sitting half done and half demolished. And some of those people are actually the ones that are moving the actions that they want to produce. Is your focus specifically in Louisville? Do you have a network of orgs in different areas in the country and action stuff? Yes. So no, our work is not only in Louisville, but we do support other folks in jamming out what that looks like. Newport, Virginia, was going through the same thing. I think I said that right. But anyway, we held a training for them. Their lawyers, their allies, and their impacted folks on what needs to be done when you're addressing that, what actions can look like when you're addressing that, and moving that forward. Actually, a lot of our folks are connected with different housing folks across the nation. So like the Homie Nalini stamp came in and immediately wanted to hear about the housing work and supporting our mothers through some trainings, and then getting them connected to the moms out in Oakland. We've yet to have that conversation, but we want to, because that's also one of the biggest actions to have. If our action was to make folks buy these properties, help us fix them up and put people in them, we definitely want to occupy these homes and take them over and take them away from people. With the organization that I created for the white folks, Reparations Roundtable, they need to do that work on the ground. So not only be in a Facebook group or in chats somewhere, but they need to be on the ground doing anti-racist work, but they also are assistants to folks wherever they are. So like the trans folks that I was talking about, a whole host of them are really on the East Coast with our folks. We just noticed that as well. We have some spaces out in the, thank you, Creighton. We have some spaces out in the Midwest that is learning how to do this work and push that anti-racist narrative and decolonizing narrative around. Also, Creighton, can you share your links as well? Your Facebook page that you have that does a critical but petty analysis around like what it looks like to see this work move, right? So Creighton to throw up there, you know, the support that they need for a family member. And we call a lot of our folks community or family members. But also, you know, like how ironic it is that also in the same breath, we're looking at things that make fun of the folks that we're doing this work for. So I love having that there, because then you can utilize the reason why I'm fundraising for this, or the reason why we have to go do an emergency report to somebody's house, domestic violence or whatever, is because you all are joking or people are holding this in high critique. And we just need to be able to like send that to different areas. You'll see Creighton is jamming that down, copy those as well. And it's me, Creighton Lee page that I'm talking about, where the critical petty analysis go. Like we have to be petty. I'm going to share this with you all, and then I'm gonna grab the links for these as well. But it'll be in the PowerPoint, so if you message me, okay, I see, because she accidentally sent it to all panelists. Sorry, y'all.
I'll copy those out.
Oh, okay, cool, thank you. I was trying to do that too. I'll get the links for these. In this comprehensive redlining Louisville, and you've probably seen this elsewhere, I did spell lining wrong. You have an ArcGIS animated mapping of how redlining has moved through the years here in Louisville. But as you read like the color of, what is that? The color of law, you'll start to understand like how that can start shaping in your mind too. Like I'm kind of visual. So when I look at some of the places that are dilapidated right now, I go back to that map and I'm like, oh, you know what? This used to be green. This is interesting. So what happened politically, socially, and economically that changed at the same time? Project South does a good job of like helping us to vision what that looks like socially, politically, and economically. This is a document that Sabrina Brazil put together of resources to use as we're talking about like what it means to create a mutual aid framework wherever we are. On our conversation last night around Free the Land, the story of New African Republic, we talked about how to move this work has to be local, right? It's like the village concept. And that's exactly what all of this is. That's what mutual aid is. That term is stolen from the village concept. So how are we making sure that people stay in home as a means to end gentrification, but also as a means to support the progressive fights that we all are picking up right now? We can't ask people to come out if they don't know if they can lay their head down at night. And I went ahead and just shared Haymarket's page for Kinga, Yamana Taylor. That book, though, is Race for Profit. And just looking at how fast and disgusting revitalization went. Like revitalization is the term that really set us up for this commodifying of gentrification now. How we revitalize the neighborhood and it just totally destroyed everybody. Passing for Black is not in there, but there's the background of May Street Kid on this page. I definitely would get that Passing for Black, even though it just talks mostly about her life in Kentucky. But we're talking about when we say like the civil rights movement, what are we looking at when we're looking at the women on the ground who organized, what that work looked like on the back end? What do we see in people like May Street Kid who are organizing through a way of legislation to make sure that they can move this work? And who did they talk to on the ground? I got a lot of elders who did work with her and who still do work, who are talking about the complications that they had. And lo and behold, we still see them today. Any other questions? And I gave that email again. If y'all want to email me from there to make sure, I'll do it again. And let's build out. If we want to hold this again in a larger space, because we do have a training that takes a little bit longer, visioning out is the main thing that I love, but also role playing and then putting it into action. And some of the tactics are some of the things that I didn't necessarily have time to do today, but I love coming up with the tactics. And I think that's a lot of what Sabrina shares on her link. Oh, you're welcome, Gail. The room is going to close in a minute. Thank y'all. I appreciate you too. You're welcome. Francis, email me. Thank you. And thank you. What's your name?
I'm also D. I signed in so I could actually chat.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah,
No,
so I
thank
went to
you.
participate too, and I do live in Kentucky, so I actually will be in touch because I would like to chat with you.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm leaving.